The last words my mother screamed at me before slamming the door were, "Don't come crawling back when you're living in a cardboard box." 3 months later, I was standing in the marble foyer of a penthouse that cost more than my entire family's net worth, holding a phone call that would change everything. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Brittany Coleman, and until 6 months ago, I thought I knew exactly what my life was supposed to look like. I grew up in Westfield, Connecticut, in one of those neighborhoods where everyone drives German cars and discusses their stock portfolios over Sunday brunch. My father, Richard Coleman, owned 3 luxury car dealerships across the state. My mother, Victoria, spent her days organizing charity galas and making sure our family maintained the right image. The Coleman name meant something in our circles. We weren't billionaires, but we were comfortable enough to look down on anyone who wasn't. My parents had mapped out my entire existence. Attend Yale like they did, marry someone from an established family, produce well-educated grandchildren, and continue the cycle of respectability that defined our world. Everything changed the day I met Marcus Rivera at a coffee shop near NYU, where I was finishing my master's in art history. I ducked in during a downpour, soaked and frustrated after missing my train. The place was packed, and the only available seat was at a small table where a guy around my age was hunched over a laptop, wearing a faded construction company t-shirt and work boots that had clearly seen better days. "Mind if I sit?" I asked, gesturing to the empty chair. He looked up, and I swear the world shifted slightly. Marcus had these warm brown eyes that crinkled when he smiled, and there was something so genuine about him that it caught me off guard. In my world, everyone performed their personalities like they were auditioning for something. Marcus just was. "Course," he said, moving his laptop to make more room. "Rough day?" I laughed, wringing water from my hair. "You could say that. You?" He gestured at his laptop screen, which showed what looked like architectural blueprints. "Trying to figure out load-bearing calculations for a renovation project. Not exactly thrilling, but it pays the bills." Over the next 2 hours, we talked about everything and nothing. He told me about the construction company he worked for, how he'd started as a laborer right out of high school and worked his way up to project supervisor. I told him about my thesis on Renaissance art patronage, expecting his eyes to glaze over like most people's did. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions and shared stories about restoring old buildings, finding beauty and craftsmanship that most people never noticed. When the rain stopped, I didn't want to leave. Neither did he, apparently. "I know this is forward," Marcus said as we gathered our things, "but would you maybe want to get dinner sometime? Somewhere without the risk of caffeine overdose." That dinner turned into 3 dates, then 10, then spending entire weekends together exploring the city. Marcus showed me parts of New York I'd never seen, family-owned restaurants in Queens where everyone knew his name, community gardens in Brooklyn where he volunteered on Sundays, jazz clubs in Harlem where musicians played until dawn. He had this way of finding magic in ordinary moments that made me see everything differently. For the first time in my life, I was dating someone who didn't know or care about trust funds and country club memberships. Marcus judged people by their character, not their bank accounts. He worked with his hands, took pride in building things that would last, and treated service workers with more respect than my parents showed their closest friends. I kept our relationship secret for months, knowing my parents would disapprove. But as Marcus and I grew closer, the weight of that secret became unbearable. I was falling in love with him, deeply, completely, in a way that made all my previous relationships feel like dress rehearsals for the real thing. The breaking point came during Christmas dinner at my parents' house. My mother was going on about the Ashford family's son, Preston, who had recently graduated from Harvard Business School and apparently asked about me at the yacht club. "He's exactly the kind of young man you should be considering, Brittany," she said, cutting her prime rib with surgical precision. "Established family, excellent prospects, and quite handsome. I told Eleanor Ashford you'd be delighted to join them for dinner next week." I set down my fork harder than necessary. "I'm actually seeing someone." The temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees. My father looked up from his wine glass, eyebrows raised. My mother's smile became razor thin. "Oh, Anyone we know? She asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. His name is Marcus Rivera. He works in construction. The silence that followed was deafening. My parents exchanged one of those loaded looks that married couples perfect after decades together. Entire conversations happening without words. Construction, my father repeated slowly, like he was tasting something unpleasant. He's a project supervisor, I said, defensive. He's incredibly smart and hardworking, and what exactly are his family circumstances? My mother interrupted, using the delicate euphemism she employed when discussing money with people who had less of it. I should have lied. I should have invented some story about hidden wealth or family connections. Instead, I told the truth. He grew up in the Bronx. His parents immigrated from El Salvador when he was 5. His father works maintenance at a hospital, and his mother cleans offices. They're good people who— Absolutely not. My mother's voice cut through my explanation like a blade. I won't have you throw away your future on some construction worker with no prospects. Marcus has plenty of prospects, I shouted back. He's starting his own contracting business next year. He's ambitious and talented and— Brittany. My father's voice carried the authority he used in boardroom negotiations. You're being naive. These kinds of relationships don't work. Different backgrounds, different values, different expectations. You think you're in love, but what you're experiencing is infatuation with someone exotic. The word exotic hit me like a slap. He's not exotic, Dad. He's American. He was born here. You know what I mean, my father said dismissively. Look, we're not prejudiced people, but marriage is about partnership, about building a life with someone who understands your world. This Marcus person might be a perfectly nice young man, but he's not suitable for our family. The argument escalated from there. Voices raised, accusations flew, and ultimatums were issued. My parents made it clear: end the relationship or face the consequences. I stormed out that night, and we didn't speak for 2 weeks. When I finally called to try to make peace, my mother's conditions were non-negotiable. Come to your senses, break up with this boy, and we can pretend this whole episode never happened. Continue down this path, and you're on your own. I chose Marcus. The formal disownment came via certified letter 3 days after I told them we were engaged. The language was cold and legal, cutting me off from the family trust fund, removing me from the will, and making it clear that I was no longer welcome at family events or properties. My mother's final text message was even more brutal. You've chosen your path. Don't expect us to catch you when you fall. My trust fund had been modest by our family standards, enough to supplement my income and provide security, but not enough to live lavishly. Losing it meant tightening my budget considerably, but Marcus and I managed. We found a small apartment in Astoria, got engaged with a simple ring he'd saved months to afford, and started planning a wedding that would cost less than one of my mother's charity luncheons. Our wedding was everything my parents would have hated and everything I loved. We held it in the community garden where Marcus volunteered, surrounded by friends who brought homemade dishes and heartfelt toasts. Maria Rivera, Marcus's mother, cried when she welcomed me to the family. His father, Carlos, gave a speech about love conquering all obstacles that left half the guests in tears. My parents' absence was a hollow ache in my chest, but I was surrounded by people who loved us for who we were, not what we represented. As Marcus and I exchanged vows under string lights and flowering vines, I felt more authentically myself than I ever had at any of my family's perfectly orchestrated events. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The first few months of marriage were an adjustment. We were broke but happy, living paycheck to paycheck while Marcus built his contracting business and I worked at a small art gallery in Manhattan. Our apartment was tiny, our furniture secondhand, and our date nights usually involved cooking dinner together and watching Netflix. But we were building something real together, something that belonged to us alone. I should have known it couldn't last. 3 months into our marriage, Marcus started acting strange.
Not suspicious strange, I trusted him completely, but distant in a way that worried me. He'd get phone calls that he'd take in the other room, speaking in hushed Spanish that was too rapid for me to follow with my basic understanding of the language. Sometimes I'd catch him staring out the window with this conflicted expression, like he was wrestling with something heavy. "Everything okay?" I'd ask, and he'd always give me the same reassuring smile. "Just business stuff, mi amor. Nothing to worry about." But I was worried. Marcus had always been transparent about his work, excited to share details about projects and challenges. Suddenly, he was guarded, secretive, in a way that felt completely foreign to who he was. The weird phone calls intensified around the time his contracting business landed what he described as a major renovation project in Manhattan. He started leaving earlier in the mornings and coming home later at night, sometimes with dirt under his fingernails, but occasionally in clothes that looked suspiciously clean for someone who'd been working construction all day. Then there were the unexpected expenses that somehow got covered. Our rent was due, and I was calculating which bills we could postpone when Marcus casually mentioned he'd already paid it. When my laptop died and I was resigned to using the library computers for job applications, a brand new MacBook appeared on our kitchen table. "The client gave me a bonus," he'd explain, but something in his eyes didn't quite match the casual tone. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in late March. I was in our tiny kitchen trying to make something edible from the contents of our nearly empty refrigerator when Marcus's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, and I watched all the color drain from his face. "I need to take this," he said, already moving toward the bedroom. But our apartment was too small for private conversations. Even with the door closed, I could hear fragments of what sounded like an intense argument in Spanish. Marcus's voice was strained, pleading, then angry. The call lasted almost an hour. When he emerged, he looked like he'd aged 5 years in 60 minutes. "Marcus, what's going on?" I demanded. "And don't tell me it's nothing. You've been acting weird for weeks, and I'm starting to feel like I'm married to a stranger." He sat down heavily at our small dining table, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I'd learned meant he was overwhelmed. "There's something I need to tell you," he said finally. "Something I should have told you a long time ago, but I was scared it would change how you felt about me." My stomach dropped. In my experience, conversations that started this way ended with confessions about other women, secret addictions, or criminal activities. I prepared myself for the worst. "My family isn't exactly what I told you," Marcus began, his voice barely above a whisper. I felt the ground shift beneath me. "What do you mean?" "I mean, my father doesn't just work maintenance at a hospital, and my mother doesn't clean offices." He looked up at me with eyes full of guilt and something that looked like fear. "They own things, Brittany. A lot of things." The words didn't compute at first. I stared at him, waiting for clarification that made sense. "What kind of things?" Marcus took a shaky breath. "Real estate. Lots of real estate. And businesses. Construction companies, restaurants, import operations. My father, he's built an empire over the past 30 years. Started with nothing when they came from El Salvador, but he had this incredible business instinct and work ethic that just never quit." I felt like I was trying to process information in a foreign language. How much are we talking about here? The last time anyone calculated the family's net worth, it was somewhere around $2 billion. The number hung in the air between us like a physical object. 2 billion, with a B. My parents, who I thought were wealthy, had a net worth maybe 1% of that figure. 2 billion, I repeated stupidly. Marcus nodded miserably. "The construction work I do, it's real, but it's for companies we own. The apartment we live in, my family owns the building. That client who gave me bonuses, that was my father, trying to make sure we had what we needed without me having to ask directly." My brain was struggling to catch up. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted you to love me for who I am, not what my family has," Marcus said, his voice breaking slightly. "Do you know how many people have tried to get close to me because of the money? How many women saw dollar signs instead of a person? When I met you, you looked at me like I mattered, like Marcus the construction worker was enough. I was terrified that if you knew the truth, everything would change. I stood up abruptly, pacing the small space between our kitchen and living room. So you lied to me for months, even after we got married. I didn't lie, Marcus protested weakly. I just didn't tell you everything. That's literally the definition of lying, Marcus. The volume of my voice surprised both of us. Do you have any idea what I've been through? What I gave up? My family disowned me because they thought I was marrying someone beneath me, and the whole time you're worth more than everyone I've ever known combined. The irony was so brutal, it was almost funny. Almost. Your family was wrong about me being beneath you. They were just wrong in the opposite direction than they thought. That phone call I overheard suddenly made sense. Who was that on the phone tonight? Marcus winced. My father. He wants to meet you. Officially, I mean. He's been asking for months, but I kept putting him off because I knew once you met him, the truth would come out.
What else haven't you told me? I demanded. Do you have siblings I don't know about? Secret children? A first wife? No, nothing like that, Marcus said quickly. Just the money thing, and the fact that my father has been quietly making sure we're okay financially without you knowing. I thought about all the times bills had mysteriously been paid, the way our landlord never seemed concerned about late rent, the groceries that appeared in our fridge when I knew we couldn't afford them. He's been taking care of us this whole time, I said, the pieces clicking into place. He wanted to do more, but I asked him not to. I wanted us to build something on our own first, prove that our marriage was about love, not money. But he's old school, you know. He couldn't stand watching his son's wife struggle when he had the means to help. The full weight of the situation hit me like a truck. Not only had I sacrificed my relationship with my family for nothing, but I'd been living a lie for months. My husband was from a family that made the Colemans look like middle-class drivers. I need some air, I said, grabbing my jacket. Brittany, please don't go, Marcus called after me, but I was already out the door. I walked for hours through the Queen's streets, my mind reeling. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, my choices, had been built on incomplete information. I'd been so proud of choosing love over money, of building something authentic with Marcus. Now I felt like an idiot. But underneath the anger and confusion, there was something else, a tiny voice asking whether this changed how I felt about Marcus himself. He was still the same man who'd asked thoughtful questions about Renaissance art in that coffee shop, still the person who volunteered in community gardens and treated everyone with respect, still the man who'd made me laugh during our tiny wedding and held me when I cried about missing my parents. The money didn't change who he was, but the deception did. When I finally came home around midnight, Marcus was sitting at the kitchen table, 2 cups of cold coffee in front of him. He looked up hopefully when I walked in. We need to talk about what happens next, I said, without preamble. Anything, he said immediately. Whatever you need. I want to meet your father, I said. I want to understand this family I married into, and I want complete honesty from now on. No more protecting me from information I have a right to know. Marcus nodded eagerly. Of course, yes, whatever you want. And I want to understand why your parents let you live like this when they could have given you anything. That's complicated, Marcus said. My father believes in earning your place in the family business. All his children started from the bottom, proved themselves before taking on bigger responsibilities. It's how he built everything, never taking shortcuts, never accepting handouts. Children, I repeated, plural. Marcus's face went slightly pale again. Did I not mention I have 3 siblings? I closed my eyes and counted to 10. This was going to be a very long conversation. The next morning, Marcus called his father while I sat beside him, my hands shaking slightly as I held my 3rd cup of coffee. I'd barely slept, my mind spinning with questions and scenarios about what this family meeting would entail.
Papa, she knows, Marcus said in English, presumably for my benefit. She wants to meet you. I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but I watched Marcus's expression cycle through relief, nervousness, and something that looked like resignation. Tonight, Papa, maybe we should. Marcus paused, listening. See, I understand. We'll be there at 7. He hung up and turned to me with an apologetic smile. He's excited to meet you. Maybe a little too excited. He wants us to come for dinner tonight at the family house. Family house? I repeated. As in, where do your parents live? It's substantial, Marcus said carefully, and my siblings will probably be there. Sophia, Diego, and Elena. They're all going to want to meet you. The rest of the day passed in a blur of anxiety and preparation. I changed outfits 4 times, unsure how to dress for meeting billionaire in-laws who I'd thought were working-class immigrants. Marcus tried to prepare me with details about his family, but every new piece of information just raised more questions. Sophia's the oldest. She runs the hospitality division, hotels, restaurants, event venues. Diego handles real estate development and construction. Elena's the youngest. She's finishing her MBA at Wharton, but she's been working in the import business since high school. And what were you supposed to do? I asked. In the family business, I mean. Marcus hesitated. Infrastructure and urban development. Papa wanted me to spearhead expansion into sustainable construction and green building initiatives. It's actually what I've been working toward with my own company, proving I could handle projects independently before taking on the bigger responsibility. At 6:30, a black car arrived to pick us up. Not a taxi or rideshare, but a sleek sedan with a professional driver who greeted Marcus by name and treated me with the kind of deference usually reserved for celebrities. The drive from Queens to the Rivera family home took us through increasingly upscale neighborhoods until we pulled through iron gates into what could only be described as a compound. The main house was a sprawling Mediterranean-style mansion that looked like it belonged in a movie about wealthy families with dark secrets. Manicured gardens stretched in every direction, and I could see at least 3 other buildings on the property that were larger than most people's homes. "This is where you grew up?" I asked, as the car stopped in front of an entrance flanked by marble columns. "The first few years, we lived in a small house in the Bronx. This place, Papa bought it when I was 12. Said he wanted his children to understand both worlds, where we came from and what hard work could achieve." The front door opened before we even knocked, revealing a petite woman with graying hair and Marcus's warm brown eyes. She immediately pulled me into a fierce hug, speaking rapid Spanish that I couldn't follow, but somehow understood perfectly. "Mija," she said, switching to accented English, "I am Maria. I am so happy to finally meet you properly." "Properly?" I asked, confused. Marcus looked sheepish. Mama might have seen some photos, and maybe asked around about you, and possibly had someone at your wedding taking pictures from a distance. "You had spies at our wedding?" Marcus protested, laughing. "Just concerned family members who wanted to see Marcus marry such a beautiful girl. Come, everyone is waiting." She led us through a foyer that belonged in a museum, with marble floors and a chandelier that probably cost more than my parents' house. The living room beyond was elegant but warm, filled with family photos and comfortable furniture that showed this was a home, not a showpiece.
3 people stood as we entered, and I immediately saw the family resemblance. They all had Marcus's dark hair and expressive eyes, but each carried themselves with a confidence that spoke of lives lived without financial uncertainty. "Brittany," said a woman who looked to be in her early 30s, stepping forward with a genuine smile, "I'm Sophia. We've been dying to meet you." The man beside her, tall and broad-shouldered like Marcus, but with shorter hair and an expensive suit, extended his hand. "Diego, welcome to the family." The youngest, a woman about my age wearing jeans and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly salary, bounced over with obvious excitement. "Elena, I cannot believe Marcus kept you a secret for so long. We've been planning your welcome party for months." "Welcome party?" I looked at Marcus in panic. "Elena gets carried away," he said quickly. "No parties necessary." "Nonsense," said a deep voice from the doorway. "My new daughter deserves a proper celebration."
I turned to see Carlos Rivera entering the room and immediately understood where Marcus got his presence. He wasn't a large man physically, but he commanded attention the way only truly successful people do. His handshake was firm, his smile genuine, and his eyes held the kind of intelligence that had built empires from nothing. Senora Rivera, he said formally, then broke into a grin. May I call you Brittany? I have been looking forward to this meeting for many months. Over dinner, served in a dining room that could have hosted a small wedding, I learned the real story of the Rivera family's rise. Carlos spoke with obvious pride about the early years, the struggles, the calculated risks that had paid off exponentially. I came to this country with nothing but determination and a willingness to work harder than anyone else, he said, passing a platter of his wife's incredible paella. But I also understood that in America, if you're smart and persistent, you can build anything. The key is never forgetting where you came from while never limiting where you can go. He started with one food truck, Sophia added, selling Salvadoran food to construction workers. Used the profits to buy a small restaurant, then another, then started investing in the buildings instead of just renting them. 25 years later, Diego continued, we own hospitality businesses in 6 states, commercial real estate in major cities from coast to coast, and import operations that supply specialty foods to restaurants nationwide. Elena leaned forward conspiratorially. And Marcus is supposed to take over the sustainability initiative that could double our construction revenue in the next 5 years. He's been researching green building technologies and urban development strategies since college. I looked at my husband, seeing him in an entirely new light. You never mentioned you went to college. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. I have a degree in civil engineering from Columbia and an MBA from NYU that I finished part-time while working construction. I wanted to understand every aspect of the business before taking on larger responsibilities. He's the most educated of all of us, Sophia said proudly, and the most stubborn about proving himself independently. It's important, Carlos interjected seriously. Each of my children needed to demonstrate they could succeed without the family name opening doors. They needed to understand the value of work, the reality of building something from the ground up. Marcus chose the most difficult path, working in construction and starting his own company, but he's also gained the most valuable experience. The conversation flowed for hours, covering everything from family traditions to business strategies to their plans for expansion into renewable energy. I found myself relaxing, despite the surreal circumstances, drawn in by their obvious love for each other and their genuine interest in including me in their dynamic. But it wasn't until Carlos walked Marcus and me to the car later that evening that he addressed the elephant in the room. Brittany, he said, placing a gentle hand on my arm, Marcus tells me your family objected to your marriage because they believed you were marrying beneath your station. I nodded, unsure where this was leading. Carlos's expression grew serious. I want you to know that we would have welcomed you regardless of your background. Love is not about money or status. It's about finding someone who makes you better than when you were alone. Marcus has been happier these past months than I've seen him in years. But, he continued, I also understand that your sacrifice was based on incomplete information. Tomorrow, I'd like you to come to my office. There are some things I want to discuss with you. Opportunities, perhaps, to bridge the gap between the choice you made and the reality you've discovered. As we drove home through the city lights, my head spinning with revelations and possibilities, Marcus reached over and took my hand. So, he said quietly, what do you think? I squeezed his fingers, still processing everything I'd learned. I think, I said slowly, that your father wants to make sure I don't feel like I gave up my family for nothing. Marcus nodded. He's big on making things right, sometimes in ways that are bigger than the original problem. I had a feeling I was about to discover exactly what that meant. The next morning, I stood in front of the Rivera Holdings corporate headquarters, a gleaming 40-story tower in Midtown Manhattan that I'd passed countless times without ever imagining I had any connection to it. The company logo was etched in brushed steel across the entrance, understated but unmistakably expensive. Marcus had offered to come with me, but I'd declined. Whatever Carlos wanted to discuss, I needed to face it alone, as myself, not as Marcus's wife who needed protection or translation. The elevator ride to the 38th floor felt endless. When the doors opened, I stepped into a reception area that looked like it belonged in an architectural magazine. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking views of the city, and everything from the furniture to the artwork spoke of success achieved and maintained. "Mrs. Rivera," said the receptionist, a polished woman in her 50s who smiled like she'd been expecting me for weeks. "Mr. Rivera is ready for you." Carlos's office was a study in controlled power. The man himself stood behind a massive desk, but what caught my attention was the wall behind him, covered with photographs spanning decades. Pictures of construction sites, restaurant openings, family celebrations, and what looked like meetings with politicians and business leaders I recognized from news coverage. "Brittany, please, sit," Carlos said, gesturing to a comfortable chair across from his desk. "Thank you for coming. I know this must all feel overwhelming." "That's one word for it," I said, accepting the coffee his assistant brought without being asked. Carlos settled into his chair, studying me with those sharp eyes that had clearly served him well in business negotiations. "Tell me about your family's reaction when you chose Marcus." The directness of the question caught me off guard, but I found myself answering honestly. I told him about the ultimatum, the disownment, the cruel final words from my mother. As I spoke, Carlos's expression grew increasingly serious. "And they made this decision based purely on what they perceived as Marcus's lack of financial prospects?" he asked when I finished. "Essentially, yes. They couldn't understand why I'd choose love over security, as they saw it." Carlos leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "In my experience, people who make decisions based solely on money usually reveal more about their own insecurities than their wisdom. Your parents' reaction says nothing about your judgment and everything about their priorities." "But they weren't entirely wrong," I admitted. "I did give up financial security. I just didn't know that Marcus could have provided even more security than I'd had." "Which brings me to why I asked you here," Carlos said, opening a folder on his desk. "I've spent the last few months learning about you, Brittany, your education, your work in the art world, your thesis on Renaissance patronage. I've also had my people look into your family's business." My stomach dropped. "Your people?" "Due diligence," Carlos said matter-of-factly. "When someone marries into my family, I need to understand all the potential complications. What I discovered was interesting." He slid a thick document across the desk. The letterhead read, "Coleman Automotive Group, Financial Analysis." "Your father's dealerships are struggling," Carlos continued as I flipped through pages of charts and numbers. "Have been for 2 years. Competition from online sales, changing consumer preferences, and some questionable expansion decisions have put significant strain on his cash flow. He's been using credit lines to maintain the appearance of prosperity." I stared at the numbers, recognizing the dealership names but shocked by the financial picture they painted. "How bad is it?" "Without major changes or an infusion of capital, he'll likely be forced to sell or declare bankruptcy within 18 months, Carlos said bluntly. "Your trust fund? It was liquidated 6 months ago to cover operational shortfalls. That disownment letter you received was as much about cutting expenses as it was about expressing disapproval." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Not only had my parents disowned me, but they'd been lying about their own financial situation while doing it. The security they'd claimed I was throwing away had been an illusion. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Carlos's expression softened slightly. "Because I believe in solving problems, especially when they affect my family. Your parents treated you poorly based on false assumptions about both you and Marcus. But more than that, they're about to lose everything they've spent their lives building." He opened another folder, this one significantly thicker. "I'm prepared to make an offer to acquire Coleman Automotive Group, a generous offer that would allow your father to retain management control while providing the capital needed for modernization and expansion." I looked up from the documents, trying to understand the implications. You want to buy my father's business? I want to solve multiple problems simultaneously, Carlos corrected. Your father gets to save his legacy and maintain his pride. You get the opportunity to rebuild your relationship with your family. And Marcus gets a wife who doesn't have to carry the weight of having sacrificed everything for love. And what do you get out of it? Carlos smiled, and for the first time, I saw where Marcus got his warmth. I get to welcome my new daughter properly, without the shadow of family conflict hanging over our future together. And, not incidentally, I've been looking for entry points into the automotive retail market. Your father's locations are well positioned for the kind of comprehensive automotive services we're interested in developing. The offer was staggering in its scope and generosity. Not just a buyout, but a complete restructuring that would transform my father's struggling dealerships into part of a larger automotive services network. Carlos had even included provisions for modernizing their facilities, training staff in new technologies, and establishing partnerships with electric vehicle manufacturers. There's one condition, Carlos said as I continued reading. The offer requires your participation. My participation? You have a master's degree in art history with a focus on patronage and cultural institutions. I'm expanding Rivera Holdings into arts and culture, museums, galleries, cultural centers. I need someone who understands both the business and artistic sides of that world. He slid yet another document across the desk, a job offer that my gallery salary looked like pocket change. You'd be Director of Cultural Development, responsible for identifying acquisition opportunities, managing our arts investments, and developing relationships with artists and cultural institutions. It's a position that would utilize your education and passion while contributing meaningfully to the family business. My head was spinning. You're offering to save my father's business and give me a dream job, all to make sure I don't feel bad about my family situation? I'm offering to turn a problem into an opportunity, corrected. Your father made decisions based on incomplete information and pride. Rather than let those decisions destroy multiple families, I'm suggesting we create a solution that benefits everyone involved. What if my parents refuse? Carlos's smile became slightly predatory. Your father is a businessman, Brittany. When faced with bankruptcy or a generous partnership with a proven company, most businessmen make the rational choice, especially when that partnership comes with the opportunity to rebuild their relationship with their daughter. I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the scope of what he was proposing. It wasn't just about money, it was about rewriting the entire narrative of my marriage and my family relationships. I need to think about this, I said finally. Of course, Carlos said, standing. Take all the time you need. But Brittany, understand something important. This offer isn't charity. I don't make business decisions based on sentiment. I'm proposing this because I believe it's good business for everyone involved. As I rode the elevator down, clutching the folders full of documents that could change everything, I realized Carlos had managed to do something I thought was impossible. He'd found a way to make my parents' rejection of Marcus into the foundation for something bigger and better than any of us had imagined. The question was whether I was ready to trust a man I'd known for less than 24 hours with the power to reshape my entire family's future. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. How did it go? I looked out at the city sprawling below, thinking about the conversation I'd just had and the impossible choice I now faced. We need to talk, I typed back, and then we need to call your father. Because somewhere in the back of my mind, a plan was forming that was even more audacious than anything Carlos had proposed. When I got home, Marcus was pacing our small living room like a caged animal. The contrast between the opulent corporate office I'd just left and our modest apartment felt surreal, like traveling between two different dimensions. So, he said the moment I walked through the door, what did my father want? I set the folders on our kitchen table and took a deep breath. He wants to buy my father's business, give me a six-figure job, and essentially orchestrate a family reunion that makes everyone happy.
Marcus stopped pacing. He what? I explained everything: the financial analysis, the acquisition offer, the job proposal, even the condition that my participation was required. Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression cycling through surprise, admiration, and something that looked like concern. "That's very thorough," he said when I finished. "Very Papa. He sees a problem, he finds a solution that benefits everyone involved." "But that's not what bothers me," I said, surprising myself with the words. "What bothers me is that he's treating this like a business problem to be solved rather than a family situation to be navigated." Marcus sat down across from me, reaching for my hands. "What do you mean?" "I mean, my parents didn't disown me because they were worried about my financial future. They disowned me because they couldn't accept that I'd chosen love over their approval. Carlos's plan fixes the money problems, but it doesn't address the real issue." I stood up, the idea that had been forming in the elevator finally crystallizing into something concrete. "What if we turn this whole thing upside down?" I said. "What if instead of your father rescuing my family, we made my family face the truth about what really matters?" Marcus looked confused. "I'm not following." I grabbed one of the folders and flipped to the section detailing my father's financial situation. "Your father said my parents made decisions based on false assumptions, but they also made those decisions based on their own insecurities about money and status. What if we forced them to confront that?" "Brittany, what are you thinking?" I started pacing now, the plan becoming clearer with each step. What if we took Carlos's offer, but with modifications? What if we made my parents come to us, admit they were wrong, and ask for help? "That sounds like revenge," Marcus said carefully. "No, it's accountability," I corrected. "They hurt us based on their prejudices and assumptions. They should have to acknowledge that before they get to benefit from the solution." I pulled out my phone and dialed Carlos's direct number, which he'd given me that morning. "Brittany," his voice was warm when he answered, "have you considered my proposal?" "I have," I said, putting the call on speaker so Marcus could hear. There was a pause. "I'm listening." "I want you to make the offer to my father exactly as written, but with one change. He has to call me personally to discuss it. He has to acknowledge that he was wrong about Marcus, apologize for how he treated us, and ask for my help in facilitating the deal." "Interesting," Carlos said slowly. "You want to make reconciliation a condition of the business arrangement." "I want to make honesty," I clarified. "My father needs to admit that his judgment was flawed and that he damaged our relationship based on his own biases. If he wants your help saving his business, he needs to start by repairing his relationship with his daughter." Marcus was staring at me with something between admiration and concern. Carlos was quiet for a long moment. "That's a risky strategy," he finally said. "Your father might be too proud to meet those conditions, even if it means losing everything." "Then he'll lose everything," I said firmly, "and he'll do it knowing that his pride cost him both his business and his daughter. But if he swallows that pride and does the right thing, he gets to save his legacy and rebuild our relationship." "And if he calls you?" Carlos asked. "Then I'll help facilitate the deal, take the job you offered, and we'll all move forward as a family. But it has to be his choice to humble himself and make things right." Another long pause. "Marcus, what do you think of your wife's plan?" Marcus looked at me with something like awe. "I think she's braver than both of us combined, and I think she's right. If we're going to fix this, we need to fix all of it, not just the financial parts." "Very well," Carlos said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "I'll have my lawyers modify the proposal to include your conditions. Fair warning, this approach might take longer and could backfire entirely." "I know," I said, "but I'd rather take that risk than spend the rest of my life wondering if my parents reconciled with me because they loved me or because they needed my husband's father's money." "Understood. I'll have the modified proposal delivered to your father tomorrow morning. After that, it's up to him." We hung up, and Marcus immediately pulled me into his arms. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "You're gambling our chance to fix things with your family in the hope that your father will choose pride over his business."
I'm gambling that when pushed to choose between his pride and his love for me, he'll make the right choice. And if he doesn't, then at least I'll know where I really stand. The next 3 days were excruciating. I jumped every time my phone rang, but the calls were always from work, friends, or telemarketers. Marcus tried to distract me with date nights and long walks, but I could tell he was as anxious as I was. On Thursday afternoon, I was at the gallery when my phone finally rang with my father's number. I stared at the screen for several rings before answering. "Hello, Dad." "Brittany." His voice sounded older than I remembered, strained in a way that my chest tight. We need to talk." "I'm listening." There was a long pause, and I could hear my mother's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. "This Rivera Holdings proposal," my father said finally, "it's contingent on your involvement." "Yes." "They seem to know quite a bit about our business situation." "Yes." Another pause. "Brittany, your mother and I may have been hasty in our judgment of your husband." "Hasty," I repeated flatly. "Wrong," he corrected quickly. "We were wrong. About Marcus, about his prospects, about a lot of things." I waited, giving him space to continue.
The truth is, we've been struggling financially for longer than we wanted to admit. When you told us about Marcus, about his background, we panicked. We thought you were making the same kind of impulsive decision that had gotten us into trouble with the business. What kind of impulsive decisions? My father's voice became quieter. Expanding too fast, taking on debt we couldn't service, making assumptions about market trends that turned out to be wrong. We were facing the possibility of losing everything we'd built, and the idea of you struggling financially too, it terrified us. "So you decided to disown me instead?" "We decided to try to shock you into making what we thought was a better choice," he admitted. "It was cruel and stupid, and we've regretted it every day since." I felt tears starting, but I kept my voice steady. "What are you asking me, Dad?" "I'm asking if you can forgive two foolish parents who let their fear and pride hurt the person they love most in the world. I'm asking if you'd be willing to help us save the business that 3 generations of Coleman's built. And I'm asking if there's any chance you and Marcus would consider giving us the opportunity to welcome him into our family properly." The tears were falling now, but my voice was clear when I answered. "Dad, I'll call you back in an hour with an answer." I hung up and immediately called Marcus. "He called," I said when he answered, "and I think we're about to find out if our plan actually worked." I sat in our apartment for exactly 58 minutes, staring at my phone and thinking about everything that had led to this moment. Marcus had rushed home from work and was sitting beside me, holding my hand but wisely staying quiet while I processed the conversation with my father. When I finally called back, both my parents were on the line. "Dad, Mom," I said, taking a deep breath, "I accept your apology. And yes, I'll help with the business deal. But I have conditions." "Anything," my father said immediately. "First, you're going to meet Marcus properly. Not as the poor construction worker you thought you were rejecting, but as your son-in-law, who you're getting to know for the first time. You're going to ask him about his work, his goals, his family, and you're going to listen to his answers." "Of course," my mother said, her voice thick with emotion. "Second, you're going to apologize to him directly for the things you said and the assumptions you made. He deserves to hear that from you." "Absolutely," my father agreed. "And third," I continued, "you're going to come to dinner at the Rivera family home this Sunday. You're going to meet Marcus's parents as equals, not as people you're somehow better than, and you're going to understand that the family I married into has more grace and generosity than you showed us." There was a pause before my mother spoke. "Brittany, we'll do whatever you ask. We just want our daughter back." "You never lost me," I said softly. "You just forgot how to see me." The following Sunday, I stood in the Rivera family foyer watching my parents take in their surroundings with expressions of barely concealed shock. My mother, who prided herself on her decorating sense, kept glancing around like she was cataloging every expensive detail. My father's businessman instincts were clearly calculating the value of everything in sight. Marcus appeared beside me, straightening his tie nervously. "How are you feeling?" "Like I'm watching 2 different parts of my life collide," I admitted, "and hoping they don't explode on impact."
Carlos and Maria emerged from the living room, and I watched my parents' faces as they took in Marcus's father. Carlos moved with the quiet confidence of someone who'd built an empire, while Maria radiated the warmth that had immediately made me feel welcome. The contrast with my parents' obvious discomfort was stark. Mr. and Mrs. Coleman, Carlos said, extending his hand to my father. I'm Carlos Rivera. Welcome to our home. My father shook his hand, and I could see him trying to reconcile the man in front of him with whatever image he'd constructed in his mind. Mr. Rivera, thank you for having us, and for your generous business proposal. Family helps family, Carlos said simply. But before we discuss business, I believe there are some personal matters to address. He gestured toward the living room, where Sophia, Diego, and Elena were waiting with warm smiles that didn't quite hide their curiosity about the people who'd rejected their brother. The next hour was one of the most awkward and enlightening of my life. I watched my parents navigate conversations with people they'd dismissed without knowing, slowly realizing the magnitude of their misjudgment. Elena's casual mention of her Wharton MBA made my mother blink in surprise. Diego's discussion of sustainable urban development projects had my father leaning forward with genuine interest. Sophia's stories about managing a hospitality empire that spanned multiple states left both my parents obviously impressed. But it was Marcus's conversation with my father that really changed everything. I understand you have concerns about my ability to provide for your daughter, Marcus said. I'd like to address those directly. My father shifted uncomfortably. Marcus, I owe you an apology. You do, Marcus agreed calmly. But first, let me tell you what you would have learned if you'd asked. I have degrees in civil engineering and business administration. I've been working in construction not because it was my only option, but because I wanted to understand every aspect of building and development before taking on larger responsibilities. The company I started has already secured contracts worth over $2 million for next year. He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. But more importantly, I love your daughter. Not for what she can give me, not for her family connections or her trust fund that apparently didn't exist anyway, but because she's intelligent, kind, and brave enough to choose her own path even when it disappointed people she loved. The room was completely silent. My mother was openly crying. I would have provided for Brittany and made her happy regardless of my family's financial situation, Marcus continued. But the fact that my family has resources doesn't change the fact that she chose me when she thought I had nothing. That's not something you should have discouraged. That's something you should have celebrated. My father stood up abruptly and walked to the window, his shoulders shaking slightly. When he turned back, his eyes were red. You're absolutely right, he said, his voice breaking. Marcus, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for judging you, for dismissing you, for treating you like you weren't good enough for my daughter, when the truth is, I was terrified that I wasn't good enough to keep being her father. The dam broke then. My mother rushed to hug Marcus, apologizing through her tears. My father shook Carlos's hand and thanked him for raising such an exceptional son. Elena started planning a proper wedding reception for Marcus and me. Sophia began discussing how my new job could incorporate some of my parents' connections in the art world. But it was the moment when my parents sat down with Carlos to discuss the business partnership that really showed how much had changed. Instead of the desperate gratitude I'd expected, my father approached the conversation as a peer, asking smart questions about market projections and integration strategies. Carlos responded with respect, treating him as a valued partner rather than a charity case.
There's one more thing, I said as the evening wound down. The cultural development position Carlos offered me, I want to base it in Connecticut, not New York. I want to develop cultural institutions in smaller communities, places that get overlooked by major arts organizations. That's a brilliant idea, Sophia said immediately. Underserved markets often have the most growth potential. And it would keep you closer to family, my mother added hopefully. 6 months later, I stood in the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the first Rivera Cultural Center, located in a beautifully renovated warehouse just 20 minutes from my childhood home. My parents were there, beaming with pride as I spoke about the importance of making art accessible to all communities. Marcus was beside me, having just signed a contract to design and build 2 more cultural centers in neighboring towns. Carlos and Maria sat in the front row next to my parents, all of them chatting like old friends about plans for a joint family vacation to Spain.
Elena was documenting everything for the company's social media, while Diego discussed potential real estate partnerships with my father. As I cut the ribbon and watched children pour into the new art space, I realized that my story hadn't really been about choosing between love and money, or even about family acceptance. It had been about having the courage to insist that people see past their assumptions and prejudices to discover what was really valuable. My parents learned that worth isn't measured by bank accounts or social status. Marcus's family learned that grace and generosity can heal even the deepest wounds. And I learned that sometimes the best revenge against people who underestimate you is simply proving them wrong while helping them become better people in the process. The last text I received that night was from my mother. "Thank you for not giving up on us. Marcus is everything we should have hoped for in a son-in-law, and we're proud of the woman you've become." I showed it to Marcus as we drove home past the Coleman Rivera automotive centers that now dotted the highway, each one a testament to what could be built when people chose understanding over judgment. "So," Marcus said, squeezing my hand, "any regrets about marrying the poor construction worker?" I laughed, thinking about the journey that had brought us here. "Just one," I said. "I regret that it took a $2 billion revelation for my parents to realize what I saw in you from the very beginning." "What's that?" "That you were worth everything." 1 year after that ribbon-cutting ceremony, I found myself sitting in a boardroom at Rivera Holdings, but this time as an equal partner in the conversation. The quarterly review meeting was discussing the expansion of our cultural development program, and the numbers were beyond what any of us had projected. "Brittany's community-based approach has generated 3 times the engagement we initially modeled," Elena was saying, pointing to charts showing visitor numbers, local economic impact, and community participation rates. "The Connecticut pilot programs are now being studied by cultural development organizations nationwide." Carlos nodded approvingly. "And the financial returns? Each center has become profitable within 8 months," Diego added. "Property values in surrounding areas have increased by an average of 15%, and local small businesses report revenue increases of 20 to 30%. We're not just building cultural centers, we're revitalizing entire communities." I looked around the table at faces that had become familiar over the months. Sophia was taking notes for the board presentation. Diego was already sketching plans for the next phase of expansion. Elena was calculating social media metrics that showed our centers had become destination locations for families across 3 states. But it was the empty chair next to Carlos that caught my attention. "Where's Marcus?" I asked. Carlos smiled mysteriously. He had an appointment he couldn't reschedule, something about a project that required immediate attention. After the meeting, I drove to our new house, a compromise between the Rivera family compound and my parents' neighborhood that somehow felt perfectly right for us. We'd moved in 6 months earlier, and I still got a small thrill every time I pulled into the driveway of a place that was entirely ours. Marcus's truck wasn't in the driveway, which was unusual for a Thursday evening. I called him as I walked up to the front door. "Hey, beautiful." His voice was warm but distracted. "How was the board meeting?" "Productive. Where are you?" "Your dad said you had some mysterious appointment." "I'm at the original site, where we first talked about the cultural center program. Can you meet me there?" Something in his tone made me curious. "Right now?" "Right now. Trust me." 20 minutes later, I pulled up to the warehouse that had become our first cultural center. The parking lot was empty, except for Marcus's truck, and the building was dark except for a single light in what I knew was the main gallery space. I found Marcus standing in the center of the gallery, surrounded by candles and what looked like a timeline of photographs covering the past year. Pictures from our wedding, the family dinner where my parents met his, the ribbon-cutting ceremony, holiday celebrations where both families had blended seamlessly, and dozens of moments I'd forgotten but he'd apparently been documenting. "Marcus, what is this?" He turned to face me, and I saw that he was holding a small velvet box that definitely wasn't the simple engagement ring we'd chosen together 2 years earlier. "This," he said, gesturing to the photographs around us, "is our story, the real one. Not the story about the poor construction worker and the rich girl, or the story about the family that disowned their daughter, or even the billionaire son who hid his identity." He stepped closer, and I could see his hands were shaking slightly. "This is the story about 2 people who found each other in a coffee shop during a rainstorm and built something beautiful together. Two people who proved that love isn't about what you have, it's about what you're willing to give up and what you're brave enough to fight for. I looked around at the photos again, seeing our journey through his eyes. There was my mother teaching Maria her recipe for Christmas cookies. My father and Carlos deep in conversation about business strategies. Elena and Sophia helping me plan community outreach programs. Diego showing my parents through the sustainable building features Marcus had designed. "You've been planning this for a while," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I've been planning this since the day you chose to trust me with your family's future," Marcus said. "Since the day you proved that you didn't just love me, you believed in us enough to bet everything on our ability to make things right." He dropped to one knee, opening the box to reveal a ring that took my breath away. It wasn't ostentatious, but it was clearly crafted by someone who understood that jewelry could be art. The center stone was surrounded by smaller diamonds arranged in a pattern that looked like rays of light. "Brittany Coleman Rivera," Marcus said, his voice steady now. "You married me when you thought I had nothing to offer but love. You defended our relationship when it cost you everything you'd known. You helped heal wounds between families that seemed impossible to bridge. You've built something incredible that's making entire communities better." Tears were streaming down my face, but I was smiling so wide it hurt. "I want to spend the rest of our lives proving that you made the right choice," Marcus continued. "Not because of what my family has, or what your family has, or what we've built together, but because of who we are when we're together. Because you make me braver, smarter, and more determined to be worthy of your love every single day." "Marcus, I know we're already married," he said quickly, "but that wedding was about proving we could choose love over everything else. This is about celebrating what we've built since then. Will you marry me again? Will you choose me again, now that you know everything? Will you let me spend the rest of my life showing you that your faith in us was the best investment anyone's ever made?" I was laughing and crying simultaneously. "Yes, you ridiculous, wonderful man. Yes to all of it." As he slipped the ring onto my finger next to the simple band we'd chosen during our modest engagement, I realized that this moment captured everything our journey had taught us. It wasn't about the money or the grand gestures or even the family reconciliations. It was about two people who'd seen past surfaces to find something real and then had the courage to nurture it despite every obstacle. "There's one more thing," Marcus said, standing and pulling me into his arms. "The appointment I had today, I was meeting with architects about a new project." "What kind of project?" "A wedding venue, specifically designed for couples who want to focus on love instead of showing off. Beautiful but accessible, elegant but not intimidating. I want to build a place where other people can have the kind of celebration we had, surrounded by people who love them for who they are." I stared at him, once again amazed by his ability to turn personal experience into something that could help others. "And where would this venue be?" "On the property between your parents' house and mine, a literal bridge between the two families that learned to see past their differences." As we stood surrounded by the photographs that told our story, I thought about the message I'd want people to take from our experience. It wasn't that money doesn't matter, or that family approval isn't important, or that love conquers all in some fairy tale sense. The real lesson was simpler and more complex. That people are worth more than their circumstances, that assumptions are dangerous, and that the courage to stand up for what you believe in can transform not just your own life, but the lives of everyone around you. My parents learned that worth isn't about bank accounts. Marcus's family learned that grace and generosity can heal wounds. I learned that sometimes the best way to change people's minds is to refuse to accept their limitations while giving them the opportunity to prove they can be better. But most importantly, Marcus and I learned that the strongest foundation for any relationship isn't shared wealth or social status or even shared dreams. It's shared values and the commitment to keep choosing each other, especially when that choice requires courage. 6 months later, we had our second wedding at the venue Marcus built, surrounded by both families, all our new friends from the cultural centers, and a few couples who'd asked to be married in a place that celebrated love over luxury. My mother caught the bouquet, which made everyone laugh until they realized she was seriously considering renewing her vows with my father. Carlos gave a toast about the importance of family that included everyone in attendance, regardless of blood relations. Elena documented everything, while Sofia planned the reception, and Diego ensured the sustainable building systems worked flawlessly. As Marcus and I danced to the same song we'd chosen for our first wedding, I looked around at the celebration we'd created and realized that every difficult choice, every painful conversation, every moment of uncertainty had led us exactly where we belonged. "Any regrets?" Marcus whispered in my ear as we swayed together. I thought about the scared young woman who'd sat in that coffee shop 2 years earlier, and about the confident woman she'd become through choosing love, fighting for it, and refusing to let other people's fears limit her possibilities. "Just one," I said. "I regret that it took me so long to realize that the best revenge against people who underestimate you isn't proving them wrong. It's helping them become the kind of people who would never make those mistakes again." Marcus spun me around, and as I laughed, I saw my father dancing with Maria, my mother deep in conversation with Carlos about their next family vacation, and Elena documenting everything, while Sofia planned the reception and Diego ensured the sustainable building systems worked flawlessly. As Marcus and I danced to the same song we'd chosen for our first wedding, I looked around at the celebration we'd created and realized that every difficult choice, every painful conversation, every moment of uncertainty had led us exactly where we belonged. "Any regrets?" Marcus whispered in my ear as we swayed together. I thought about the scared young woman who'd sat in that coffee shop 2 years earlier, and about the confident woman she'd become through choosing love, fighting for it, and refusing to let other people's fears limit her possibilities. "Just one," I said. "I regret that it took me so long to realize that the best revenge against people who underestimate you isn't proving them wrong. It's helping them become the kind of people who would never make those mistakes again." Marcus spun me around, and as I laughed, I saw my father dancing with Maria, my mother deep in conversation with Carlos about their next family vacation, and Elena documenting everything, while Sofia planned the reception, and Diego ensured the sustainable building systems worked flawlessly. As Marcus and I danced to the same song we'd chosen for our first wedding, I looked around at the celebration we'd created and realized that every difficult choice, every painful conversation, every moment of uncertainty had led us exactly where we belonged. "Any regrets?" Marcus whispered in my ear as we swayed together. I thought about the scared young woman who'd sat in that coffee shop 2 years earlier, and about the confident woman she'd become through choosing love, fighting for it, and refusing to let other people's fears limit her possibilities. "Just one," I said. I regret that it took me so long to realize that the best revenge against people who underestimate you isn't proving them wrong. It's helping them become the kind of people who would never make those mistakes again." Marcus spun me around, and as I laughed, I saw my father dancing with Maria, my mother deep in conversation with Carlos about their next family vacation, and Elena taking pictures that would probably end up in another timeline someday. "There's one more thing," Marcus said as the song ended. "I love you, Brittany Rivera." "I love you too," I replied. "All of you, even the parts you kept secret." And as our families and friends cheered around us, I knew that our story wasn't really ending. It was just beginning the next chapter. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.